They laughed at him. Just an old black man standing near the police tape, ignored like background noise. But when he stepped forward and spoke 5 quiet words, the entire SWAT unit stopped cold. Why? Because those 5 words revealed a truth so shocking it turned humiliation into command and mockery into stunned silence. What happened next will challenge everything you believe about respect, race, and what it really means to serve. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. Under the steel gray morning sky of Capitol Hill in Seattle, a small crowd gathered behind police barricades, watching a hostage situation unfold. The air was tight with tension and sirens. SWAT teams in matte black gear moved like clockwork, precise, rehearsed, and hardened by countless rehearsals of chaos. Amidst the sea of tactical urgency stood a man who didn't seem to belong, Thomas Green. 73, stood quietly by the yellow tape, gripping the brim of his worn fedora as the wind threatened to carry it away. His overcoat, a bit too big on his thin frame, hung from his shoulders like memory clinging to time. He didn't twitch. He didn't speak. He just watched intently, purposefully. But to the officers, he was invisible. "Hey, Grandpa," someone shouted from across the line, laughter biting through the tension like a whip. The nursing home is across town. A ripple of chuckles passed through the young cops setting up perimeters. One officer, maybe 25, swaggered over, his face split in a condescending smile. "Sir, you need to step back. This isn't a safe area." Thomas didn't blink. He pointed calmly toward the building wrapped in chaos. "I live on the 2nd floor." The officer scoffed. "Yeah, and I'm James Bond." More laughter. Thomas remained still, his eyes never leaving the apartment building, where minutes earlier 3 people had been taken hostage by a gunman. Inside, officers hustled radios, crackled with fragmented commands, and Captain Julian Watts barked into his phone, trying to coordinate an entry plan. Thomas said nothing, but his eyes moved. He saw what they didn't: the broken symmetry of the windows, the covered fire exit that hadn't been there before, the thin wiring visible beneath a flower pot on a 4th floor balcony. Details that no one else cared to see or didn't know how to read. To them, he was just an old black man with nowhere to go and nothing to contribute. A rookie leaned over to another and whispered, "Why do they always show up to these scenes? Like they're going to help. Let's just move him back." They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he used to be. Thomas had lived in that building for 27 years. He had seen families come and go, watched the skyline change as glass towers replaced old bookstores, and he had noticed 3 weeks ago when a stranger began entering the building at odd hours, always through the service door, always with a heavy duffel bag. No one listened when he tried to report it. Not the building manager, not the beat cop on the corner, just a tired old man with too much time and too many questions. Today, his questions were about to save lives. He looked across the street again, past the officers who mocked him, past the barricade and the sirens, toward a small antenna peeking out from the apartment's gutter. Barely noticeable. Definitely not part of the building's design. His lips tightened. "This is going to go wrong," he muttered to himself. The SWAT team had formed a plan, an outdated one. He could tell from the way they aligned the direction of the entry point, the lack of rear coverage. Their approach, he knew, was suicidal. Inside the police command van, the captain gestured toward building plans spread across a tablet screen. Delta team breaches here in 2 minutes, someone announced. No one questioned it. Everyone assumed control was in the hands of professionals, except for the man standing 20 feet away who saw what no one else could. Thomas made his decision. With surprising speed for a man of his age, he crossed the police line. The officers yelled, grabbing at him, "Sir, step back." But Thomas kept walking until they caught his arms. "What the hell are you doing?" The same young officer shouted. "You'll get yourself killed." Captain Watts approached, visibly irritated. "Get him out of here now." "You're all going to die if you go in there like that," Thomas said, quietly. His voice didn't rise. He didn't plead. He stated it as if he were reading a weather report. The captain rolled his eyes. "And who are you exactly?" Thomas looked him dead in the eye. Then he said 5 words that stopped the conversation, the laughter, and the air itself. "Echo unit, Langley clearance, now." The silence was sudden. The expressions on the officers' faces shifted from amusement to uncertainty, from dismissal to a cold wash of realization. Captain Watts blinked. "What did you just say?" Thomas didn't flinch. "Check it." There was a pause. Then a flurry of radios whispered confirmations and background checks that shot through encrypted networks in seconds. When the results came back, the color drained from the captain's face. The man they had laughed at, the man they shoved, had once led classified CIA field operations across Eastern Europe. He wasn't a bystander. He wasn't a relic. He was the architect of strategies they still studied in elite training schools, and now he was telling them their entire plan would lead to disaster. Thomas Green didn't ask for respect. He earned it by simply standing in truth and watching the world finally notice. And this was just the beginning. The moment the 5 words, "Echo unit, Langley clearance, now," left Thomas Green's lips, the air seemed to thin. Captain Julian Watts blinked rapidly, as if trying to erase what he'd just heard. Around them, radios paused, mid-transmission chatter faltered, and the previously buzzing scene around the command vehicle turned ghostly quiet. One of the tech officers nearby, a wiry woman in her early 30s named Agent Louise Nguyen, looked up from her laptop. She'd been scanning frequencies, triangulating cell signals lost in the rhythm of digital warfare. But when those 5 words hit the air, her hands froze over her keyboard. She leaned in and began typing furiously. "Echo unit," she whispered to herself. "That's not a regular division." Thomas stood calm, unmoved, as Captain Watts struggled to recover his composure. "Mr. Green," the captain began, his voice attempting to regain control. "I don't know what you think. Run the credentials." Thomas said, his tone still even. "You're wasting time." Watts nodded toward Nguyen. "Verify him, immediately." While the agent accessed deep archives through encrypted links, Thomas kept his eyes on the building. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need praise. He needed them to listen before it was too late. 2 minutes passed in silence. Nguyen's fingers danced over the keyboard. Then she stopped. Her voice wavered when she spoke. "He's not bluffing." She turned the screen toward Captain Watts. The image was blurry, a scan of a yellowing document marked "classified" in bold at the top. Beneath it, the name Thomas M. Green. Unit. Echo. Clearance level. Langley. Tier 7. Operation history. Redacted, redacted, redacted. But there was enough. Enough to confirm what no one had believed a moment before. Watts stared at the screen, then looked back at the man he had just tried to escort off the premises. "Sir," he said, the word catching slightly in his throat, "I owe you an apology." Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. The respect had never been his goal. The lives inside that building were. He stepped forward and pointed to the far left corner of the structure, his voice low but certain. "That balcony, see the flower pot? It's hiding a signal repeater, custom wired. The entry point you've selected runs directly into a kill zone. There are 2 charges inside, likely military grade. And unless I miss my guess, there's a third man unseen on your heat maps embedded in apartment 3C. The team looked stunned. "How do you know that?" asked Lieutenant Cruz, the negotiation specialist, her voice a mix of awe and doubt. "Because I've seen this pattern before," Thomas answered. "In '89 in the Balkans, again in Yemen, and once in Caracas. This is not the work of an amateur." Nguyen nodded slowly. "Satellite imaging confirms the equipment. We missed it. He's right." Watts turned, shouting new orders to his team, reconfiguring their positions, calling for a stand down on the original breach. But the damage had already begun. His carefully constructed authority was now held in check by the words of a man he'd just tried to humiliate. "Who's inside?" Thomas asked. A man named Samuel Laird Cruz said. Early 40s. Honorably discharged. Former explosives specialist. He took 3 people hostage, neighbors, all white, mid-30s. No clear motive yet. Thomas closed his eyes. The name meant nothing, but the profile meant everything. A trained soldier, unstable, with enough knowledge to rig a death trap, and enough desperation to follow through. "Has he asked for anything?" Thomas inquired. "Not yet." Radio silence since the standoff began. Refused food and water delivery. No negotiator contact. "He's waiting," Thomas murmured. "He doesn't want demands met. He wants someone who understands the language he speaks. Not through protocol, through memory." "You mean military memory?" Cruz asked. "No," Thomas said softly. "Trauma. You don't hold people like this because you're angry. You do it because you're unheard, unseen. And when you spend years training to protect a nation only to be discarded, that silence turns into desperation." Captain Watts looked lost for a moment, like a man realizing he'd walked into a room without knowing the cost of being there. "Are you suggesting we send you in?" "I'm not suggesting," Thomas replied. "I'm informing. You want to stop this without bloodshed. You let me talk to him." Watts hesitated. "It's not protocol." "Neither is your entire team dying in a failed breach," Thomas said. The weight of his words wasn't in their volume, but in their certainty. Lieutenant Cruz, who had been silent, finally stepped forward. "Let him in," she said. "He's the only one here who understands the storm that man inside is living through." Watts looked around at his team. No one spoke, and so with a reluctant nod, he stepped aside. "Fine. You've got 10 minutes. Thomas didn't wait for further instruction. He walked toward the building's entrance, his back straight, his movements slow and deliberate. No bulletproof vest, no radio in his ear. Just the certainty of a man who had walked into fire before and survived not just the flames, but the silence that followed. As he approached the door, Cruz called after him. "What should I tell them if you don't come out?" He turned, not with fear, but with quiet purpose. "Tell them the 5 words I said," he replied. "They'll know why I went in." And just like that, he disappeared into the building. Outside, no one moved. The tactical team waited. The captain held his breath. Cruz stood frozen, her fingers curled into her coat sleeves. The man they had laughed at was now walking into danger with nothing but experience and belief. And somewhere deep inside, Samuel Laird was waiting. The hallway was narrow, lit only by the flickering emergency lights that cast long shadows along the cracked walls. Dust hung heavy in the air, and each of Thomas Green's steps echoed like a question unanswered. He wasn't moving cautiously out of fear. His gait was deliberate, like a man walking toward a memory he'd never quite buried. Apartment 3C loomed at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. The silence was uncanny. No shouting, no demands, no panic. Just a stillness so deep it felt unnatural. He paused just outside, exhaled through his nose, and knocked once. The door creaked open. Inside, the apartment was dim, the blinds drawn tight. A lamp glowed in the far corner, casting a yellow haze over the scene. On the floor, 3 civilians, 2 women, and 1 man sat against the wall. Hands zip-tied, eyes wide but unhurt. Between them and the door, seated with his back to the window, was Samuel Laird. He was younger than Thomas expected. Maybe 42, maybe younger. Though his eyes carried years, his face didn't. They were sharp, restless, but not frenzied. His hands rested in his lap, close to the detonator that lay beside him on a makeshift table wires, sprouting like weeds from its body. Samuel didn't reach for the device. He didn't shout or panic at the sight of the man who had just entered. He merely looked up and asked, "Who sent you?" Thomas stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "No one sent me. I came because I know the terrain you're standing in." Samuel narrowed his eyes. "You military, I was. Echo Unit, Cold Operations Division, Langley Clearance." Samuel's lips twitched, not a smile but recognition. "I heard of Echo," he muttered. "Ghost Unit. Most people think it's a myth." Thomas shrugged. "We preferred it that way." A tense pause filled the room. The hostages stared between the 2 men, sensing something deeper happening, something they weren't meant to interrupt. Samuel leaned forward slightly. "So what do you want?" "I want to understand," Thomas said. "Not the situation. You. What broke that didn't get fixed?" Samuel's eyes flashed the question, cutting deeper than any negotiation tactic. "What broke?" he repeated. "Everything. The day I came back." He pointed at the ceiling as if the story were written there. "They give you a flag and a handshake. They take your weapon and your uniform. And then they take your name, piece by piece. I applied for help 6 times. PTSD, tremors, insomnia, paranoia. They said I didn't qualify. Said I was stable enough not to be a threat, but not broken enough to treat." Thomas nodded slowly. "They want you whole or gone. Anything in between they ignore." Samuel let out a bitter laugh. "And now I'm here, holding 3 people hostage just to get someone to look me in the eye." "You think this makes them see you?" Thomas asked. Samuel's voice cracked. "No. But it makes them stop pretending I don't exist." Thomas stepped closer. His movements were measured, but not timid. "Do you remember how's our dog?" he asked suddenly. Samuel blinked. "What how's our dog?" 1997. IED buried under a goat cart. We lost 2 men before anyone saw it coming. I was there. So was Lieutenant Carrillo. He took shrapnel to the lung. Samuel's face stiffened. He knew the name, knew the place. "That operation was never recorded," Samuel said. "Most of mine weren't," Thomas replied. "But I remember everyone. I remember what it felt like to be surrounded by silence when you got back." like your whole identity had been folded into a classified file no one would ever read. There was a long beat of silence. "I've been where you are," Thomas continued. "I've stood in rooms full of people who smiled like they were grateful and walked away like I was nothing more than a shadow. And for years I carried the weight of it alone, until I realized something." "What's that?" Samuel asked. "That I didn't need them to validate my pain. I needed them to change because of it." Samuel looked away. His jaw clenched. His fingers brushed the side of the detonator, then pulled back. "I didn't want to do this," he murmured. "I didn't plan to hurt them. I just wanted a platform. Something that would make the silence crack." Thomas's voice softened. "You already made your point, son. The world is listening now. Not because of the threat, but because of the truth you carry." He paused, letting the words settle. "You think this moment is the end of your story? It's not. It's the beginning of how you rewrite it." Samuel closed his eyes. The tension in his shoulders sagged. His hand drifted over the table past the detonator toward a photo folded in half under a coaster. He handed it to Thomas without a word. It was a picture of a young boy, maybe 5, standing in front of a weathered apartment complex, grinning, missing a front tooth. "My son Samuel," said his voice breaking. "Lives with his mother. I haven't seen him in 3 years." Thomas looked at the photo, then back at the man before him. Then let this be the moment he remembers his father for, not as a threat, but as someone who took the pain and chose something better. Another long silence followed. Finally, Samuel reached down. Slowly, deliberately, he disconnected the wires from the device. No dramatic countdown, no final standoff, just a quiet act of surrender, one not of weakness, but of strength. Thomas took the device, handed it to one of the hostages. "Give this to the officer at the door. Tell them it's over." The man nodded and scrambled out, barely believing what he'd just seen. Thomas sat beside Samuel, who now looked smaller, emptied out by years of holding in what no one had been willing to hear. "Someone's going to arrest me," Samuel said. "Probably," Thomas replied. "But this time, they'll also hear your story." "And you?" Thomas smiled faintly. "I've walked this road before. I just never thought I'd walk it twice." Outside footsteps thundered up the hallway, but Thomas remained still. His work wasn't done. It was only beginning. The hallway outside apartment 3C had turned into a war zone of emotions. Officers paced back and forth, unsure whether to prepare for bloodshed or redemption. Through the thick air and the tension in their radios, a ripple had started, carried by the whisper of 5 words and confirmed by the silence that followed the bomb's deactivation. Inside, however, another battle was just beginning. Not with weapons, but with reckoning. Thomas Green sat across from Samuel Laird as the younger man cradled the photograph of his son. The rawness in Samuel's expression wasn't just fatigue, it was the face of a man standing at the precipice of everything he believed he had become. Thomas had seen that look before, in the mirror, in fellow soldiers who had been turned into ghosts of themselves by systems that remembered their service only when convenient. "Do you want him to see this side of you?" Thomas asked gently. "Is this the image you want your son to carry into adulthood?" Samuel shook his head. "I wanted him to see strength." "This is strength," Thomas replied. "To come back from where you were headed. To still have the clarity to choose something better when the world has given you every excuse to crumble." Samuel looked up, eyes red but open. "But what now?" Now. That was always the hardest part. What comes after the adrenaline, after the apology, after the noise fades. Redemption doesn't come with sirens. It begins quietly behind the closed door of the mind, the room most men never find the courage to enter. Thomas stood and motioned toward the back room of the apartment. "There's something back there you need to see." Samuel hesitated, then followed. The room was small, musty, and sparsely furnished. But what stood out was the collection on the far wall, dozens of notebooks stacked in neat towers, photos tacked on corkboard newspaper clippings, discharge papers, and appointment slips from VA hospitals. This was not the lair of a madman. It was a war memorial, a silent archive of pain, effort, and erasure. "These are all mine." Samuel set his voice, barely a whisper. "I tried every way I knew to reach out. I even offered to volunteer with trauma units. They told me I wasn't a good fit, said my background might trigger others." Thomas picked up one of the notebooks. The handwriting was meticulous. Page after page of entries documenting symptoms, flashbacks, dreams, patterns. Samuel had been trying to map his own mind, trying to stay ahead of a darkness no one else had offered to understand. "They always ask for discipline in the military," Samuel said. "But when you apply that same discipline to healing on your own, it scares them." "You scared them," Thomas nodded. "Because you weren't asking for pity. You were asking for accountability." For a long moment, the two men stood silently, surrounded by the unspoken story of a soldier who had done everything right and still fallen through the cracks. But here, beyond the threshold of violence, they stood inside the room where the real change would have to begin. "I don't want to be a symbol," Samuel finally said. "You won't be," Thomas replied. "You'll be a reminder. That silence doesn't mean safety. That sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one holding a weapon, but the one whose pain has been ignored for too long." Outside, the sound of heavy boots echoed up the stairwell. The SWAT team was moving again, but this time with purpose, not panic. The lieutenant in charge, Helena Cruz, approached the apartment carefully, her voice low and respectful through the comms. "Mr. Green, Mr. Laird, we'd like to escort you out safely. Medical personnel are standing by." Samuel flinched at the thought. "They'll treat me like a criminal." "They might," Thomas admitted. "But this time, I'll be walking beside you, and they'll have to look at both of us when they pass judgment." The walk out of the apartment was unlike any arrest. It was quiet, reverent even. No handcuffs, no barking orders. Lieutenant Cruz stood at the door, her eyes searching Samuel's face not for guilt, but for understanding. "You okay to walk?" she asked. Samuel nodded, still clutching the photo of his son. The corridor, once filled with derision and mockery, now parted like a path of solemn acknowledgement. The same officers who had jeered hours earlier stepped back not out of fear, but out of respect, born from the realization that they had witnessed something larger than protocol. Outside, a crowd had gathered: journalists, residents, bystanders. Many had recorded the scene's chaos, but now they watched in silence as Samuel emerged, no longer the enemy, not yet a hero, but something more dangerous to a broken system, a man who had been heard. As Thomas and Samuel reached the ambulance, Captain Voss approached. His face was a complicated map of pride and embarrassment, authority and remorse. "Green," he said gruffly. "Wasn't expecting this today?" "Neither was I," Thomas replied. He nodded at Samuel. "You handled yourself unexpectedly." Samuel said nothing. The captain looked away, then leaned toward Thomas. "There's already talk of damage control, narrative framing. You know how this goes." Thomas's voice was cool. "Then make sure the story isn't about a gunman. Make sure it's about what drove him to the edge and why no one stopped him before he got there. That night, Samuel Laird sat in a hospital room, not as a suspect, but as a veteran finally surrounded by people who wanted to understand, not contain. His story was out now. And in the room beyond the door, beyond the violence, beyond the humiliation, a new chapter waited to be written. Because once the door closes on the chaos, there is only the echo of what was learned and whether the world outside is finally ready to listen. Of all the stories that emerged in the weeks after the standoff in Chicago's South Side, few carried the haunting weight of Thomas Green and Samuel Laird. Media headlines flickered with sensationalism. Veteran disarms hostage taker with words. The elder they mocked was a legend. But beneath the noise, a quieter truth unfolded. The kind that lives not in spotlight, but in shadow. The kind that doesn't shout, but lingers in the hearts of those who bear witness. Thomas never sought a stage. Even after the footage went viral, the moment Samuel surrendered, and the hostages emerged unharmed, the moment the SWAT team froze at Thomas's 5 words, he remained largely out of the public eye. Journalists came knocking, eager for an exclusive. TV producers pitched documentaries. Politicians floated statements of support. Thomas refused them all. He understood that visibility was a double-edged sword. To some, he was a savior. To others, a threat, a reminder that authority doesn't always wear a uniform or a title, but sometimes walks softly in shoes, worn down by years of watching and remembering. He didn't need to tell his story in interviews. It was already being whispered across police precincts, classrooms, and community halls. What Thomas did do, however, was begin visiting veteran outreach centers across Illinois, quietly, unannounced. He'd sit in the back of group therapy sessions, not speaking until someone asked. When he did speak, it wasn't with grandeur. It was with precision, the kind that came from having carried things heavier than metals. At the Garfield Veterans Recovery Center, one of the therapists later recalled, Thomas said just one sentence that stayed with everyone in the room. Not all war wounds bleed. And in that silence, dozens of veterans nodded. Samuel's path was different. While he was not charged with terrorism, his case triggered a national debate about mental health in the armed forces. His psychological assessments painted a clear picture of untreated combat trauma exacerbated by systemic neglect. With Thomas's advocacy, he was entered into a specialized rehabilitation program tailored for former elite operatives who had slipped through the cracks. Some called it mercy. Thomas called it overdue responsibility. 6 months later, Samuel was living in a transitional housing program in Joliet, undergoing daily therapy, volunteering at local youth centers. He never gave interviews, but one day, when a young boy at the shelter asked him, "Were you really a bad guy?" Samuel replied, "I was a lost guy. There's a difference." His words resonated. Meanwhile, the Chicago PD, stung by the public's response to how Thomas was initially treated, initiated sweeping reforms. Training materials were revised. A new department within Internal Affairs was created focusing specifically on interactions with veterans, people of color, and the elderly. One of the initiatives was co-designed by Lieutenant Helena Cruz, the officer who had been among the first to truly listen. She started a project called Echo Training, where young recruits reviewed real-life scenarios alongside mentors from diverse backgrounds, including veterans like Thomas. The goal wasn't to memorize protocol, but to practice perception, to learn how to see what's beneath the surface. Thomas agreed to consult on the project, but only under one condition: no honorary titles, no ceremonial plaques, just action. The initiative quietly transformed departments across several precincts. Arrests declined in high-risk communities. Use of force incidents were cut by a third. More importantly, public trust, once a fractured mirror, began to reflect a sliver of repair. And still, Thomas kept walking in the shadows. He spent mornings tending a small garden behind his apartment building. The kids in the neighborhood called him OG Green, a nod to his quiet presence and the stories he sometimes told, always laced with metaphor and truth. He never mentioned Delta Force or classified missions. What he did say, often while pulling weeds or pruning vines, was this: you don't fix a field by shouting at the weeds. You kneel down, get your hands dirty, and stay long enough to know what's worth saving. On the 1-year anniversary of the standoff, no parade was held. No politician gave a speech. But outside apartment 3C, a makeshift memorial appeared: 3 candles, a photo of the hostages, and a handwritten note. Thank you for showing us the power in stillness. That night, Thomas stood quietly in front of the door, hands folded behind his back. He didn't touch the candles. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, then turned and walked down the stairs. Because legacies aren't always written in headlines. Sometimes they live in the spaces where people begin to look differently at others and at themselves. That was Thomas Green's gift. A legacy built not on spotlight, but on shadow. A reminder that change doesn't start when the world watches. It starts when someone dares to act, even when no one believes in them yet. Thomas Green's story began, as so many like his do, not with a spotlight, but in the shadows, dismissed, overlooked, and disrespected. An elderly black man standing outside a tense police scene, mocked for his age, disregarded for his skin, and underestimated for what the world had chosen not to see. He said nothing at first, and yet within him lived a history that stretched far beyond that moment on the sidewalk. He had worn no badges of honor on his chest, only the quiet dignity of a man who had once commanded teams, saved lives, and sacrificed more than most could imagine. The 5 words he uttered didn't just halt a SWAT team. They cracked open the false narratives we build around appearances, reminding us how often we fail to see the full truth of a person. When Thomas stepped forward, not in defiance, but with quiet urgency, he shifted the course of an operation and the lives of everyone present. He didn't save the day with brute force or dramatic heroism, but with clarity, wisdom, and presence. What unfolded wasn't just a hostage rescue. It was a rescue of perspective. Through Thomas, we witness the unraveling of assumption, the transformation of mockery into reverence, the slow but irreversible awakening of those who had once looked past him. His legacy wasn't carved into stone, but etched in the choices that followed: officers rethinking their instincts, a nation questioning its biases, and a former soldier like Samuel Laird being given a chance to heal rather than be erased. Thomas never asked for recognition. He didn't demand apologies. He simply acted when it mattered most. And that's what made all the difference. So what is the deeper lesson here? It's that greatness doesn't always come wrapped in the packages we expect. Sometimes it stands quietly at the edges of chaos, waiting to be heard. It's that respect should never be conditional on titles, uniforms, or age. Dignity is a birthright, not a reward. Thomas Green taught us that true strength isn't loud, it's steady. And that sometimes the most powerful words aren't the ones shouted, but the ones spoken when the world refuses to listen. For all of us watching this story unfold, the takeaway is clear. Slow down. Look deeper. Question your assumptions. Honor the wisdom that time brings, even if it comes in a form you don't recognize right away. In our homes, workplaces, communities, choose to listen before you label, respect before you dismiss, and act with humanity before authority. If this story moved you, even just for a moment, we ask that you subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us keep bringing stories like Thomas Green's to light stories that challenge the way we see the world and inspire us to change it one quiet act of courage at a time. Subscribe now and help us make sure the voices that matter never go unheard again.